All right, welcome to Eight Dimensions of Mind, episode 3, where I'm going to begin to dip into the model a little bit with going to give kind of a high level overview of things and start to work my way down from there. So, Eight Dimensions of Mind, typically, as I've been kind of discussing this in previous episodes, the 8 circuits of consciousness model is what this is commonly known as, the 8 circuit model. Or Antero, Alli has been using 8 circuit brain to denote this model. And I'm using 8 dimensions of mind in this series here. So what's that about? Well, one, circuits is kind of that was Leary's word for these different dimensions. He was always fascinated with the new and groovy and cool. And then the 1970s, integrated circuits and computers were the new and groovy and cool. And there was a lot of discussion about the brain as a computer, neurons as circuits. That discussion has continued quite a bit to this day. And actually, I just read a paper last week that was completely debunking the whole idea of the brain as a computer. But nonetheless, we just feel like circuit is kind of a binary on-off type of thing. It's a little bit dated and moving into dimensions. Now, again, I think 8 dimensions of mind is what Robert Anton Wilson referred to the model as when he taught it for the final time at the Maybe Logic Academy in his final years of life. Again, same reasoning I'm giving you, that circuits is dated, so let's go with dimensions. And I think we can go with words like consciousness and mind or psyche even, but we're putting mind in parentheses because, or not parentheses, but quotations to indicate that this is kind of an undefined term. We really don't have a concrete definition of mind. And I'm along those lines, I put a definition in there from Dan Siegel in his book, Mind. He spends a good first third of this book kind of teasing out his working definition of mind. And I put the short version there in the PowerPoint, but I'm going to read you the long version, a little bit longer. An embodied and relational, self-organizing, emergent process that regulates the flow of energy and information both within and between. Within, let's say, the body, and between the body and the environment. Maybe that's an explanation there I'm throwing out there. Another quote from the great psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist, who's working on right-left hemisphere differences in the cortex. The world comes into being through our relationship with it. It's not just made up by us, and it's not some separate other, but a coming together of the two. Put that in there to emphasize this is a relational process. And that's really what I want to bring as a relational perspective. And then the final quote that I like in thinking about consciousness and all of this is a quote from the founder of Hakomi Therapy, Ron Kurtz, where it's not a quote, it's just a phrase he used, the organization of experience. It's kind of what we're talking about. And to me, that evokes, Robert Anton Wilson terms like reality tunnel. How are you organizing your experience? What's your reality tunnel? And I'm going to distinguish that separate from belief system, which I believe belongs more to a specific conceptual dimension. And we'll talk about that some other day. But so that's kind of when we think about 8 dimensions of mind, what I'm thinking about is the organization of experience. We could also say, how are you perceiving reality? How are you processing reality? And how are you expressing into reality? It's another way to look at it. But aside from all that, we're, take the next step further. We've got lower and upper dimensions. Well, I'm defining the lower as the physical, emotional, conceptual, and social dimensions, whereas the upper are the spiritual dimensions. And we're going to go into more detail into each of those, but just to give you kind of a high level overview of where I'm coming from. Now, I'm not trying to rename the dimensions here. I'm just throwing these terms out there as an easy way for anybody off the street to kind of identify with this physical, emotional, conceptual, social, spiritual. seems like something most people are going to be able to relate to right away. So that's why I'm using these words. I'm not trying to name these dimensions that way. I'm just throwing them out there so that we can quickly and relate to them. So if I move on to the lower dimensions here, physical, emotional, conceptual, social, what we really find is each of these dimensions is really defined by specific developmental stages. And maybe a quick and easy way to think about those are the infant, the toddler, the preschooler, and the adolescent. And they're going through processes of being a baby, being cared for, walking and developing independence, talking and learning to interact with the world, also fine motor skills, learning to engage with the world, problem solve, predict, and then finally adulting, where really the adolescent is moving from what we might call a dependent stage of life to more of an interdependent stage of life. And I'm getting into each one of those, but again, just some kind of quick and dirty reference points to think about each of these dimensions oriented in developmental stages. And so if we're going with this developmental stage approach, then what I want to do is take the latest and greatest and everything we know about developmental psychology and neuroscience, particularly this field of intersubjective neurobiology, which is kind of an all-encompassing term for a bunch of folks that are out there really pushing relational psychology and developmental psychology as well forward. And they're kind of, at least Dan Siegel here is referring to that as intersubjective neurobiology. So that's the main perspective I'm going to draw on in giving a relational perspective on the 8-circuit or 8-dimension model. So if we've got all that, again, we're going to take the latest to inform our definition of these lower dimensions. Like if we take, what does the science say at this moment? What's the latest in theory and the latest in science say about these different dimensions that we can apply to our definitions of these dimensions? And when I talk, again, intersubjective neurobiology, I'm saying, well, one, we develop in relationship to our environment, and that two, human relations have a huge influence on this environmental field that we're developing in. For example, an infant is primarily influenced by his or her relationship with the primary caregiver, the mother. And as we get deeper and deeper in each of these dimensions, we'll go into that a little further. As I get deeper and deeper into each of these dimensions, we'll go a little further. And so the key tenet, or one of the key tenets of this whole idea, is that we kind of, as we develop, we take these environmental snapshots in at key moments of development. So the thought was that for the infant, the moment of birth was like this critical window of development, and they would take an environmental imprint at the moment of birth, the infant would, or that the toddler would take an environmental imprint at when it started walking and asserting its independence, or when the preschooler starts talking, it's kind of taking this environmental snapshot, and that's having a profound impact on like a lasting imprint on the consciousness of this individual. And what we're finding is that actually is what happens, but it's not quite the same as proposed, where things like taking your first steps or getting born are the key moments. It's actually, what we're finding is that there's a combination of genetic potential and environmental influence that combines in an epigenetic imprint during a critical window of activation of individual structures of the nervous system. So maybe zoom out. Let's think about it like this. From conception, you basically got a single-celled organism, and that's fairly, the nervous system is fairly fully formed by about 5 years old. So we're going from like one cell to a fully formed nervous system at 5 years old. And as that nervous system is developing, particularly in roughly the 3rd trimester in the womb to about 2 or 3 years old, that's really where a lot of things are happening. Individual structures in the brain are turning on, and as they turn on, they're taking in a bunch of environmental information, and they're kind of locking in this epigenetic imprint. And And that's more or less locked in at the time of development. And then not much happens from about 5 years old until puberty, when the nervous system goes through, particularly the prefrontal cortex up here, the front brain goes through another growth spurt. And then something actually very different happens. So, we're talking infant, toddler, and preschooler. If you've been around little kids, they're like sponges. They're just indiscriminately absorbing everything from their environment. And they're not really saying, no, I'm not going to take that in. They're just taking it all in. And they're very much generalists, just observing everything in their environment. But then when you get to adolescence, something very different happens developmentally at the nervous system level. What happens is that there's just an explosion of connections already established in the brain. And in adolescence, those connections, they're forming neural networks. And in adolescence, the unused connections just fall off, calls it pruning. And so, for example, when my son was starting puberty, about 13 years old, he was taking piano lessons. And so that experience of learning piano at that critical differentiation age, when he's pruning all his networks, all the networks that are involved with piano, the fine motor skills, reading music, playing the piano, interpreting the music, all those different functions in his neural networks are being preserved because those are being used during this critical phase in his life. And so the cortex prunes down the connections that aren't used and just sticks with the ones that are being used. So it's kind of a use it or lose it type thing. And then what happens from there is that all those remaining neural connections are think of it like bare copper wire in electrical work. And then if you insulate that wire, the electricity travels a lot better. So what happens is you get this insulation process, myelination is what it's called, where all the neural networks get insulated so that the signal is transmitted a lot more quickly and more accurately. Dan Siegel likes to refer to this pruning and myelination process as differentiation and linkage. And again, it's we're going from the young child that is a generalist to this adolescent that becomes differentiated, specializes in things. And so we are seeing things sort of freeze in time and take their imprint on the human nervous system. There's this epigenetic imprint, and there's these neural networks that are forming and being kind of cemented in, so to speak. So that is a part of our process here. So whatever your environmental experiences are when you're an infant, those are going to be sort of locked in to your nervous system from back then around infant consciousness. And that's with you for the rest of your life. But as we move on, what about brain change? And that was what Robert Anton Wilson would say. That was one of Leary's major heresies, is to say that we could change our brain, which back then it was sort of felt about 5 years old, your brain stopped developing and we were good, and it just never changed after that. And now most of us know about neuroplasticity, which means that the neural networks that we have in our brain can change and adapt. And that might be more along the lines of what we tend to think of as conditioning when we talk about imprints and conditioning. Neuroplasticity probably fits more along what we think of as conditioning, whereas these epigenetic imprints are more about imprints. And that's, again, taking this environmental imprint at a critical time of activation and kind of getting locked in, and that modulates genetic expression. That determines whether certain genes are being expressed or not, depending on the environmental influence at the time that particular nervous system structure came online. So we have these methods of change, epigenetic change. Epigenetics is really a very cutting, bleeding edge science. I'm going to be honest, I don't have a good handle on it. I haven't put a lot into studying it, and my understanding is that it's just so new that there's not a hell of a lot to study. So I'm a little rusty on it, but when we talk about imprinting, that's where you're going to find it, is in epigenetics. And now we're going to be learning hopefully more and more about how to change those epigenetic imprints. But in Gestalt therapy, we talk about change as a process that happens. Usually we have what we call an impasse. There's a block. I want to do something, but I feel like I've something in my way. There's something prohibiting me from showing up in a certain way. And the job of the Gestalt therapist is then to come in and sort of disturb that block, disturb that homeostasis, and kind of create an opening for spontaneous reorganization of the psyche or the mind. And but allowing for that by supporting the client and allowing them to reorganize on their own, but kind of providing that support and presence there while that happens. And I bring this up because we have our own method of disturbing homeostasis, or way of defining it using the 8-circuit model. And that is through these upper dimensional experiences that I believe, disturb lower circuit homeostasis. And that the idea here is that upper dimensional experiences lead to change, which leads me into upper dimensions. I'm calling these spiritual experiences, non-ordinary states of consciousness. Again, I'm going to go into these more detail on another day, but these upper dimensional experiences can be a shock to the lower dimensions. And we'll speak of a shock of bliss, like, oh, I didn't know it was possible to feel this good. The shock of liberation and uncertainty, the shock of unity, all is one, one is all, the shock of impermanence. Those are the kind of shocks we experience from these upper circuit spiritual experiences, or we can experience through these upper dimensional, upper circuit spiritual experiences. And I'm running with the premise that there's a tight connection here between, say, dimension 1, physical experience, and dimension 5, the shock of bliss. And that these upper dimensional experiences expose lower dimensional disintegration and underdevelopment. It kind of tells us where our work is, where we can work through some things to integrate experience. And our lower dimensional integration allows for deeper upper dimensional experiences. I mean, if we get our developmental foundation straightened out, that creates capacity for more spiritual experience, more bliss, more liberation, more unity, more impermanence. Now, when we talk about these upper dimensional experiences, they're mystics have been talking about this for thousands of years. Every spiritual practice has tried to describe these experiences in some way, shape, or form. And it's difficult to describe these experiences. They're often beyond words. And what I'm suggesting here is, well, to back up, if we use developmental psychology and everything we know about that to inform our definitions of the lower dimensions, and then if we have the supposition that the lower dimensions are tied to the upper dimensions, then let's use our definition of the lower dimensions to help define the upper dimensions. Just kind of creating a methodology here for this, and some kind of rhyme or reason. Everybody gets the model, the 8-circuit model they deserve, the 8-dimension model they deserve. So if you've got a definition that works for you, cool. I'm trying to create an elegant model, and this is the way I'm going about it. If it works for you, awesome. And if it doesn't, maybe you'll find some things that work in your definition of the model. Not everybody really gets into this upper lower relationship thing, but I feel pretty strongly about it. So I want to use my lower dimension definition to inform my upper dimension definition based on that relationship between the two. And again, I'm just trying to put a methodology here. If you look at some of the books like Starseed Signals, where Robert Anton Wilson discusses his work with Leary in developing this model, a lot of what they're doing is like, where do we draw the lines here? You know, it's this kind of blurry mush of these spiritual experiences. And how do we define these different categories? Where do we draw the lines that separate a fifth dimensional experience from a sixth dimensional experience? Some of it is arbitrary. So I'm just trying to put a little methodology behind it. And that's the idea here with what we're doing and what I want to do as I move forward. And just to create an elegant version of this, the most elegant version of this model I can find. As far as these relationships are concerned, Timothy Leary hinted at a lower upper relationships, but he never really went into it. Robert Anton Wilson, I don't think really ever discussed it at all. He had sort of a different view of the model and didn't see that lower upper connection. Antero Alli has not only seen that connection, but has expanded on it with this shock anchor thing. That shock anchor relationship is Antero's one of his contributions to the model. And so that's what we're rolling with. And, you know, that's the general idea here of where I'm going to be going. I think the next episode, I'm going to go into the lower dimensions in much more detail, but still from kind of an overview perspective, and then do some more on upper dimensions and imprinting and change and waking up, that sort of thing. And then going into each of the lower dimensions in real exhaustive detail, maybe not that exhaustive, but one by one. So that's where I'm hoping to go with this, and it keeps changing as I move forward, but that's the general idea. Thanks for sticking with me this far, and we'll see you next time.